Franklin and the Babysitter by Sharon Jennings. Franklin could count by twos and tie his shoes. He was old enough to walk to Bear's house alone and go to the ice cream store on his own. But Franklin wasn't old enough to stay home all by himself. When his parents went out, Granny came to take care of him. One afternoon, Franklin's parents were getting ready to go to a party. Franklin and Harriet were watching out the window. "When's Granny going to get here?" Franklin asked. "I want to show her my new puzzle, and she promised to bring her fudge." Just then, the phone rang, and there was bad news. Granny was sick with a cold. Franklin was very disappointed. So was his mother. "I really wanted to go to the party," she sighed. "We can still go," said Franklin's father. "We'll just get a babysitter." "I don't want a babysitter," complained Franklin. "I want Granny." "Granny is a babysitter," replied his father. "No, she isn't," answered Franklin. "Granny's Granny." Franklin's mother started making phone calls. Soon she announced that Mrs. Muskrat could babysit. "Mrs. Muskrat?" cried Franklin. "But she's never taken care of us before. She won't know what to do. "Franklin," replied his father, "you and Harriet like Mrs. Muskrat. You'll have fun together." Said Franklin. Mrs. Muskrat arrived at 5 o'clock and settled in. "If you need anything, here's her phone number," said Franklin's mother. "Don't worry about us," said Mrs. Muskrat, shooing Franklin's parents out the door. "We'll be just fine. Won't we, Franklin?" Franklin wasn't so sure. Mrs. Muskrat turned to Franklin and Harriet. "Why don't you two keep me company while I start supper?" "Can we do my puzzle?" Franklin asked. "First thing, after I make us a nice soup," replied Mrs. Muskrat. Franklin frowned. "Granny does puzzles first thing," he said. It wasn't long before Mrs. Muskrat called Franklin and Harriet to the table. Franklin peered into his soup bowl. "Are those Brussels sprouts?" "I hate Brussels sprouts," he exclaimed. "I'm sorry, Franklin," said Mrs. Muskrat. "I didn't know." "Granny knows," Franklin muttered. When supper was finished, Mrs. Muskrat asked Franklin and Harriet what they would like for dessert. "Granny always brings fudge," replies Franklin. "Well, why don't we make some?" suggested Mrs. Muskrat. Franklin got out sugar, butter, and cocoa. Harriet got out some pots and pans. Franklin cheered up a bit as a sweet smell filled the air. As soon as the fudge was ready, Mrs. Muskrat gave Franklin the first piece. "Is it good?" she asked. Franklin nodded. "But Granny always puts flies in her fudge," he said. "Oh dear," sighed Mrs. Muskrat. "I forgot how much she loved flies." "Granny never forgets," said Franklin. As Mrs. Muskrat was cleaning up the kitchen, Franklin turned on the radio. "Welcome to Shadowland," said the announcer. Mrs. Muskrat frowned. "I think that show is a little too scary for a young turtle," she said. "No, it isn't," declared Franklin. Then he fibbed. "Granny lets me listen." Mrs. Muskrat sighed. Mrs. Muskrat left to put Harriet to bed. Franklin settled into his chair. The show began with moans and sighs and eerie cries. Then came clanking and creaking, rustling and squeaking. Franklin looked around. What was that shadow behind his bedroom door? What was that tapping noise in the corner? Mrs. Muskrat found Franklin shivering and shaking in his chair. She turned off the radio and held him on her lap. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Muskrat," Franklin whimpered. "Granny doesn't let me listen to Shadowland. Now I'm too scared to go to sleep." Franklin started to cry. Mrs. Muskrat thought for a moment. Then she said, "If I was Granny, I'd let you stay up late and keep me company." Franklin wiped his eyes. "I think Granny would do that," he agreed. When his parents came home, Franklin and Mrs. Muskrat were sipping hot chocolate in front of a glowing fire. They were on their second bowl of popcorn and their third puzzle. As Mrs. Muskrat was leaving, Franklin gave her a big hug. "Granny's still my Granny," he told her, "but you're my favorite babysitter."